10. Luftwaffe Plains. In 2003, a Luftwaffe transport plane was salvaged from the waters off the island of Leros and taken to the Hellenic Air Force Museum in Athens for preservation and display. It was a Junkers Ju-52 model aircraft which served on virtually all World War II warfronts that the Germans fought on. During the fall of 1943, the British and the Germans engaged in a fierce battle for control of the Dodecanese Islands, which had been under Italian control since 1912. The fighting lasted for several days and ended with a German victory over the island of Leros. A German soldier's remains were found inside the plane, and they were identified and sent back to his family. Authorities also found ammunition, personal belongings and guns, which have since gone on display at the HAF Museum. The Ju-52 is also on display after undergoing extensive preservation and still bears the bullet holes from anti-aircraft guns that shot it down nearly 80 years ago. Another German plane, a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, was also salvaged from the waters off Leros. The Stuka was a dive bomber and ground attack aircraft that served its purpose well during the war's early stages, but it lost its air superiority before the end of the conflict and became a prime target among anti-aircraft operations and Allied fighter planes. Sources suggest the Stuka recovered near Leros was likely shot down in October 1943 after taking off from Rhodos Island. After spending 70 years at the bottom of the sea, it was transported to the HAF Museum, where it was put on display beside other historic wrecked planes. 9. A yellow brick road. Recent news headlines reported on the alleged discovery of an underwater yellow brick road, possibly leading to the lost island of Atlantis. The articles are referring to a unique rock formation that scientists found on the ocean floor near Hawaii in what's known as the Liliuokalani Ridge. It certainly looks man-made at first glance, and the team who found it even described it as looking like a yellow brick road. But they didn't mean it in literal terms, and news reports took some creative liberty by using such attention-grabbing headlines. Found during the Nautilus expedition, which seeks to learn more about our vastly unexplored oceans, the so-called Yellow Brick Road was formed naturally. Researchers identified it as a fractured flow of hyaloclastite rock, which settles on the seafloor after forming during high-energy volcanic eruptions. News website CNET explained that the brick-like pattern forms from the eruption's heating and cooling cycles. But by now, it's likely that at least some people believe the more outlandish parts of the story that some other media outlets have put out. 8. An ancient city. Retired architect and amateur archaeologist George Gelley believes that he's discovered a submerged ancient city off the Gulf Coast near the Chandeleur Islands, an uninhabited archipelago located roughly 50 miles, 80.5 kilometers east of New Orleans. That's about the length of the Panama Canal. It's certainly possible that the area was dry land during the last ice age, before global temperatures increased and sped up glacial melting, causing sea levels to rise. Gelley believes that the alleged lost city, dubbed Crescentis, may have existed long ago, predating civilizations like the Aztecs, Mayas, and Incas. He claimed he found granite masses at the submerged settlement, and that there are hundreds of buildings buried in sand and silt along the sea bottom. Even more surprisingly, Gelley said that these structures are geographically related to the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt. While it might sound crazy, he is truly convicted of his research on the site, which he's been carrying out for nearly a half-century. He's even gathered sonar images of what he believes to be ancient buildings, along with an enormous pyramid. Gelley says that the pyramid is 280 feet, 85 meters tall, and that it emits intense geomagnetic energy. That's almost as tall as the Statue of Liberty. Fisherman Ricky Robin claims to have experienced the energy firsthand, telling local station 4WWL that his compass spun out of control when he got near Crescentis, and that one can expect all the electronics on their boat to stop functioning too. Robin also said the fishermen in the area have been finding strange square-shaped rocks for years, and that he believes they're from the underwater pyramid. Mainstream experts disagree with Gelley's theories. These square rocks, for example, could be from old shipwrecks or may have been used for ballast on ships in the past. They're also quick to point out that granite is not native to Louisiana or Mississippi, making its alleged presence beneath the waves highly questionable. In the meantime, Gelle hopes to uncover more evidence of Crescentis as he continues to explore it after making 44 visits already. 7. SS Atlanta. The 172-foot-long schooner SS Atlanta capsized and sank in Lake Superior in 1891. The ship is just a little shorter than the Leaning Tower of Pisa. This was after a strong gale snapped the towline connecting to its companion steamer. The ship began to quickly take on water, causing its 7-person crew to scramble for a lifeboat. Only 2 of them survived. The Atlanta wreck was finally found last year off Deer Park, Michigan, where it sits 650 feet beneath the water's surface. That's about as deep as 2 football fields are long. Researchers were mapping the lake's bottom using sonar when they spotted the sunken ship. Speaking with Newsweek, Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society spokesperson Corky Adkins described the process as a lot of tedious and boring and monotonous work, filled with little specks of joy and high-fiving. At first, the team wasn't sure what their sonar system had detected, so they returned to the site with a remotely operated vehicle, or ROV, and could see the well-preserved wreck clear as day. Footage reveals that the ship's 3 masts broke off during the storm, just like the 2 survivors had said after being rescued. Atlanta is one of the 3 shipwrecks the team found last summer, around the estimated 6,000 wrecks that have happened across the Great Lakes to date. 6. 460-year-old hunting bow. Earlier this year, National Park Service NPS employees discovered an ancient hunting bow laying in 2 feet of water in Alaska's Lake Clark National Park and Reserve. Radiocarbon dating revealed that the bow is around 460 years old and that it was made sometime between 1506 and 1660. But where the bow comes from is an even bigger question than its age. It was found in south-central Alaska, on lands where the ancestors of the indigenous Dena'ina people once lived, yet the bow may not be of Dena'ina origins. Researchers consulted with local elders and compared it with similar objects from around the same time, and the bow appears to have more in common with artifacts that were crafted by the Yupik and Alutiiq cultures. The Dena'ina interacted with other indigenous groups in the region, including the Yupik, which could explain how the bow ended up on Dena'ina ancestral lands. At the last update, researchers were still working to determine where the bow came from. They sought the help of wood identification expert Dr. Priscilla Morris, who believes that the bow is made from spruce. To know for sure, she'd have to examine a cut fragment of the artifact under a microscope, but the NPS wants to keep it intact because it's a rare discovery for the region. So the team may have to rely on less invasive clues to get to the bottom of the mystery. Should they cut the bow to examine it or leave it intact? Let us know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel before the end of the video. 5. Maya Canoe. Recently, Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology and History, INAH, announced the discovery of an intact ancient Maya canoe submerged in an underwater sinkhole or cenote. They found the 1,000-year-old boat on the Yucatan Peninsula at a site known as San Andres. In the ancient world, the area consisted of many ceremonial sites that were used by many indigenous communities. It's a great place to look for artifacts. But the recent canoe discovery is special because it's the most intact Maya canoe ever found. Experts believe it was built sometime around 830 and 950 AD, but we'll have a more precise date after performing a tree ring analysis, which will tell the boat's exact age. The canoe came as a surprise to the team that found it, who were taking a break when they spotted an ancient watermark on the cenote's wall and went down to investigate. Inside a cavern, 150 feet below ground, about half as tall as Big Ben, they discovered the 5-foot-long, nearly 3-foot wide, it's about the size of a refrigerator. Archaeologists believe the canoe was used for carrying water out of the cenote or to bring offerings to the cavern. Besides the boat, the team found human remains, ceramics, a painted wall mural, and other artifacts. They were exploring the area in anticipation of a controversial rail project that's slated to travel through the area. Many fear this will put thousands of sacred and historically important ancient sites at risk of destruction. 4. A submerged medieval town. Nicknamed Yorkshire's Atlantis, the once bustling medieval port town of Ravensor-Ott was founded near the mouth of England's Humber River around 1235. At its peak, it had over 100 houses, a dockside market, wharves, warehouses, a court, a jail, and a harbour where it saw frequent ship traffic. The town was eventually abandoned, and its deserted remains were flooded by a massive storm in the 1350s. What was left of the town was swept to the bottom of the North Sea, and nobody's located it yet. But sedimentology professor Daniel Parsons believes researchers are closer than ever to discovering Ravenseur-Ott, and if he's right, hopes that an excavation would follow. Lobster vessels have discovered evidence of the town along the seabed, and Parsons believes he may be able to use high-resolution sonar to locate it. He told The Guardian that he believes it's especially important to find Ravenseur-Ott because it can teach today's experts about how coastal change can impact communities. This is a bigger problem that's coming into play in a bigger and more concerning role in many parts of the world as we grapple with the effects of the ever-changing world. 3. Huge cache of bombs. A group of magnet fishers were trying their luck at Daisy Nook Country Park near the English town of Oldham earlier this year when they discovered a massive stash of around 1,000 bombs. They piled the explosives up at the bottom of the canal they were fishing in and contacted the police, who reported to the scene along with the EOD, Britain's elite bomb squad. People find explosive devices all over the world, many of them in places where nobody would think to find them. From the accidental leftover explosives of more than 100 years' worth of wars to the improvised explosive devices IEDs put in place by terrorist organizations worldwide, the risks to innocent people from explosive devices are much greater than most people think. Magnet fishing enthusiast Sophie Doyle told the Manchester Evening News that the group pulled up many types of explosives, too many for experts to identify them all at the time. Emergency services cordoned off the area and removed the bombs. The area was reopened just hours later. It was the second time in a week that the group discovered a large number of explosives. The previous weekend, they'd found around 200 bombs. Authorities believe that the cache of bombs found at Daisy Nook were railway explosives that were left behind and forgotten about long ago. So what does the EOD do with these kinds of finds? Modern military EOD techniques are classified top secret to prevent their distribution to prospective enemy bomb makers or to any of the various extremist organizations around the world. 2. A missing continent. Between 87 and 79 million years ago, a sizable chunk of the Earth's crust broke free from the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana and began sinking into the ocean. By around 23 million years ago, it was completely submerged. Scientists discovered the 2 million square mile sunken landmass known as Zealandia during the 1990s. That's about twice the size of Tibet. As the name suggests, it is close to New Zealand. But they weren't initially sure what it was, and they spent years going back and forth about what to classify it as. Finally, in 2017, a study announced that Zealandia met all the qualifications for being classified as a submerged continent rather than a continental fragment. At roughly 1 billion years old, it's the world's youngest continent. It's also the smallest and thinnest and contains just a handful of islands sticking out of the water. The remaining 94% of Zealandia sits beneath the waves, where it went unnoticed for centuries as explorers searched for new continents. It hasn't been studied much because it sits thousands of feet below the water's surface. But now that scientists know it's there and about its significance, they're working to learn more about it. The continent is doubtful to reveal all its secrets soon. Researchers find it difficult to make discoveries when the whole thing is over a mile deep below the sea, and the deposits needed to be tested are 1,640 feet beneath the seabed. It's buried about 1.5 times down, as tall as the Eiffel Tower. It's really difficult to go out and research a continent like that. It'll take a lot of time, money, and work to go out on ships with a lot of equipment and survey the sections. If nothing else, the world's 8th continent confidently shows that nearly 400 years after Abel Tasman discovered New Zealand in 1642, there's still plenty to be discovered. 1. 5,000-year-old human bone. Simon Hunt was out on the River Thames in London one morning when he discovered a femur or upper leg bone in the water. Upon realizing it was human, he was extremely concerned that it might be recent, even though it looked old. Howell took the bone with him and showed it to his wife before calling the police, who asked him to take them to the site where he found it. By then, the high tide had come in and it wasn't possible to search the area. Police sent the femur off for testing, which revealed that it was around 5,000 years old. The person it belonged to lived sometime during 3516 and 3365 BC during the last Stone Age. It was a period marked by the arrival of farming in England, predating both the buildings of Stonehenge and the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. While it's impossible to know whether the person was male or female, an archaeologist has estimated that they were around 5 feet 7 inches tall. The police gave the bone back to Hunt, and for now, he keeps it in his house in a place where his cat can't get to it. He hopes it will eventually sit alongside a Neolithic human skull fragment at the Museum of London, which houses many artifacts that have been found along the banks of the Thames River. While a license is normally required to search for and collect artifacts from the river, Hunt was simply taking a stroll while unintentionally coming across the bone, and he didn't get in any trouble for taking it.
Number 8. The Franklin Expedition. 19th century explorers scrambled to be the first to discover a polar sea route linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans known as the Northwest Passage. One such expedition led by Sir John Franklin set sail in 1845 aboard the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror with a 129-member crew. 2 months into the voyage, the vessels became icebound in Canada's Victoria Strait. The crews remained on the ships for a whole year before they decided to try reaching civilization on foot. They had packed several years' worth of food, so their reasons for abandoning the Erebus and Terror remain unclear to this day. Meanwhile, the rest of the world waited to learn of the crew's fate, unaware of just how bad things had gotten. Over 100 search missions that took place over the next decade failed to find any clues of what had happened. Answers slowly came over time when the discovery of human remains, handwritten notes, personal belongings, and eyewitness reports started to roll in. The evidence showed that the men died in different places at different times and for different reasons throughout their quest for survival. Malnutrition and disease proved to be major killers among the men, but the question of why they left their ships behind in the first place lingers to this day. In 2015, a study of deceased expedition members' remains confirmed long-standing rumors that at some point, Franklin's crew resorted to cannibalism. Local Inuit tribes had reported seeing piles of broken human bones, leading many to believe that the crew met a desperate end. Bone evidence shows that they first ate the muscles. They then cracked the bones open and ate the marrow in what's known as end-stage cannibalism. The Erebus and Terror were finally discovered in 2014 and 2016. Researchers hope to find diaries, photos, documents, and other evidence that might be able to help them better understand the crew's decision to desert the ships and which may help to solve any other mystery surrounding the ill-fated expedition. Number 7. The Octavius Ghost Ship. According to legend, a 3-masted schooner called the Octavius appeared off Greenland's west coast in 1775. The story claims that the 5-man crew of a nearby vessel, the Yearold, spotted the derelict ship and went aboard to investigate. They ventured below deck and found the dead, frozen, and perfectly preserved remains of 28 men. The captain of the Octavius supposedly died sitting at a table in his cabin with a pen in his hand and his logbook in front of him. Nearby lay the bodies of a woman, a child under a blanket, and a sailor with a tinderbox. Unwilling to continue with their search, the terrified crew from the Yearold grabbed the captain's logbook and disembarked. The logbook's last entry was dated November 11, 1762, nearly 13 years earlier. According to the captain's writings, Octavius had reached the Orient that year after leaving England in 1761. For the return voyage, the captain ordered the crew to sail through the Northwest Passage, a notoriously treacherous and frigid sea route through the Arctic Ocean that serves as a connection between the Pacific and Atlantic. This would perhaps explain why the ship's crew met such a tragic end. But Octavius was never seen again after the Yearold crew supposedly found it, and its logbook no longer seems to exist. Consequently, many modern historians have written the entire story off as a myth. Number 6. SV Kaz 2. In April 2007, 3 sailors boarded a 39-foot-long catamaran called the SV Kaz 2 with plans to sail around Australia for 2 months. At the helm was the skipper, Des Batten, joined by brothers Peter and John Tunstead. They left from the White Sunday Island and were bound for Western Australia, where they all lived. 3 days later, the vessel was found drifting 100 miles off the Australian coast, not far from where it departed, with the engine idling. Other than having a ripped sail, it was in near perfect condition. The sailors were nowhere to be found. Aboard the SV Kaz-2 were scattered newspaper pages, a laptop, a pile of clothing, and a half-empty coffee cup. It was an eerie scene, but there were no signs of foul play. Some suggested that the men had crossed paths with pirates or drug smugglers, or that a supernatural event was responsible. Others theorized that they staged their disappearance for insurance money. Batten and the Tunsteads were never found. Investigators surmised that the Tunstead brothers had fallen overboard while trying to untangle a fishing lure from the boat's propeller, and that Batten fell overboard while trying to save them or while searching for them. In 2008, the coroner in the case concluded that the men all died in a freak accident. But because the ruling was strictly circumstantial and no bodies had ever been found, some people continue to doubt that the ordeal was an innocent tragedy and wondered if something far more sinister happened. Number 5. The RMS Queen Mary. From 1936 to 1967, the now retired British ocean liner RMS Queen Mary carried 2.2 million passengers across the Atlantic from Europe to North America, with the exception of its years of service as a troop ship during World War II. The ship was grand, boasting 5 dining areas and lounges, 2 cocktail bars, 2 swimming pools, a grand ballroom, a squash court, and a small hospital. Today, it's permanently docked in Long Beach, California, where it functions as a floating hotel and haunted attraction with 3 restaurants and a venue hall. Hotel guests get the opportunity to not only be surrounded by the original wood paneling and portholes, but to perhaps encounter one of the ship's long-gone passengers. In 2008, Time magazine included the Queen Mary on its top 10 haunted places list, which describes the ghost of a sailor who died in the ship's engine room, children who drowned in the pool, and a creepy woman known as the Lady in White. Guests who dare and are willing to shell out a pretty penny can stay in one of the vessel's most haunted rooms, including stateroom B340, where a man died of unknown causes in 1948. Ever since, passengers and staff alike have claimed to see a man who disappears into thin air. There are also stories about an invisible force that rips the bed covers off, strange knocking on the door at night, and the bathroom sink left running despite no guests staying in the room. There's also the Mauritania room, where 3 maids watched a woman vanish before their eyes in 1989, and the pool, where people have seen a woman in a tennis skirt vanish, as well as a lady in an old-fashioned wedding gown standing next to a little boy dressed in a suit. Would you dare spend the night aboard this ghost ship? Let us know in the comments below and hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 4. Neira. The Neira was a steam tug that sank off Cape Jaffa near southeastern Australia in 1917 during a severe storm. It was pulling an American sailing ship called the Astoria when it began listing in rough seas. In a last-ditch attempt to save both themselves and the Astoria's crew, the Neira's crew cut the tow lines. Unfortunately, it was too late for the tugboat, which went down as waves smashed its engine room door in. 2 crew members clung desperately to the top of a wrecked lifeboat and miraculously survived. Sadly, 14 others tragically succumbed to the unforgiving seas. The surviving pair managed to paddle to a lighthouse and were pulled to shore by its keepers, who braved the tempestuous sea in order to save the men's lives. They ended up receiving medals for the courageous rescue. Today, the Neira's remains sit 164 feet below the water's surface. Diver Steve Seville found the 104-year-old wreck in 2019 after researching it for several years and with the help of local fishermen. Speaking with 9 News, Seville described the historic vessel as a popular tug of Port Melbourne that helped to solve all sorts of shipping problems around Australia. Descendants of the Neira survivors and one of the lighthouse keepers were informed of the landmark discovery. Number 3. SS Bechimo. Originally a German trading vessel, the SS Bechimo was seized by Great Britain as a World War I reparation. From there, it fell under the ownership of the Hudson Bay Company as a trading ship that routinely traversed the Atlantic between Scotland and Canada, doing business with local Inuit tribes along the way. While sailing in the Canadian Arctic in 1931, the steel-hulled steamer became trapped by ice floes. The crew abandoned the ship and awaited rescue in a makeshift shelter nearby. They lost sight of the Bechimo during a blizzard later that day, and it vanished by the time they awoke the next morning. The men simply assumed that it had sunk, but a week later an Inuit man claimed that he had seen the vessel. It was too damaged to salvage, so the crew retrieved what cargo and belongings they could and once again deserted the ship. Over the next several decades, there were numerous reported sightings of the Bechimo, earning it the nickname of the Arctic Ghost Ship. The last verified sighting happened 320 miles north of the Arctic Circle in 1969, off the coast of Barrow, Alaska. Nobody has reported seeing the ship since then. Finally, 37 years after being abandoned by its crew, the Bechimo finally vanished for good. Deserted ships don't typically linger in coastal areas for long. Usually they're swept out to sea by currents, and either way, they eventually rust and sink. The oddest thing about the Bechimo is how long and how frequently people continue to see it. What's even more strange is that nobody has found any signs of debris or wreckage since it was last spotted. The Alaskan government began a search for the ship in 2006 as a last-ditch effort to find it, but no traces of it have appeared, and it's probably safe to say that until or unless it's found at the bottom of the ocean, the Bimo is gone for good. Number 2. Misy. In 2013, former sailing enthusiast Mike Kuhn and his girlfriend set sail from England in his sailing yacht, the Misy. The South African couple had sold their homes with plans to pursue economic opportunities in the Caribbean. A crew spent a month showing Kuhn the ropes. Then he continued toward his destination alone while his girlfriend made plans to fly to their new home. The crew had reassured Kuhn that he could handle the voyage on his own, and although the weather report called for 4 days of somewhat difficult weather, it looked like it would be smooth sailing after that. By his 3rd day at sea, Kuhn was encountering swells of up to 13 feet as he struggled to lower the Misy's sails. He tried to wait out the storm, but eventually started to panic and called for help. By then, he'd gone 2 days without sleep. A nearby tanker diverted from its route to rescue Kuhn, but had trouble getting close enough to his yacht to help him. He tried clinging to a rope that was thrown down from the ship, but ended up stranded in the water for 90 minutes while the tanker turned around and came back to look for him. This time, he held onto the rope for dear life and immediately collapsed once he reached safety. Kuhn returned to South Africa in his wetsuit and with just a few dollars to his name. Meanwhile, the Misy continued to drift until it appeared along the Namibian coast. After an extensive internet search, the boat's discoverers finally identified Kuhn as its owner. By then, he had decided he was done with life at sea. He told the authorities to collect any valuables that were still aboard, but that he was not interested in retrieving the yacht. Sadly, there was nothing on the boat worth retrieving, especially considering the tight budget that Kuhn was left with after the rescue. In 2014, the Ministry of Fisheries and Marine Resources clarified that it would decide what to do with the wreck. Number 1. MFV Zyla. Built in 1975, the MFV Zyla was a South African fishing trawler that became stranded near the Namibian town of Henties Bay in 2008. It ran aground during the early morning hours in a popular fishing spot known as Zyla and was too damaged to repair. The ship was already stripped down to its shell when it was sold as scrap to an Indian company, but it never reached its new home in Bombay. In fact, the vessel didn't go far at all. It broke free from its tow rope before even getting the chance to leave Namibian waters and began to drift with 2 crewmen aboard. They spent the night stranded on the Zyla in tempestuous weather with nothing but walkie-talkies and life jackets to protect them. Luckily, the boat drifted back toward a fishing area which would have normally been empty on a weekday morning. But it was a holiday, and an entire crowd turned up for what they thought would be an uneventful day at the beach. A group of fishermen alerted local authorities to the distressed ship while 2 men bravely got onto a rubber raft and went to try rescuing the crew members. It took them an hour just to get the raft close enough to the Zyla, where the stranded sailors had no choice but to jump onto the raft and hope they landed properly. The fishermen looked on and cheered as the crewmen jumped and thankfully made it onto the raft. Everyone involved was extremely lucky to emerge from the ordeal with only minor injuries. The Zyla remains in the water today, where it started to deteriorate noticeably from being constantly battered by the waves.
9. Little Big Horn. The Battle of the Little Big Horn is one of the most well-known battles in America's military history. For years after the battle, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was thought of as an American hero for his last stand against the tribes of the Lakota, North Cheyenne, and Arapaho Native Americans. Many modern historians have recognized Custer's many mistakes before and during the battle, which led to a crucial victory for the Native American chiefs Crazy Horse and Chief Gall. Notably, Custer completely misjudged the number of enemies camped near the Little Bighorn River, ignoring his native scouts' reports that the campsite was the biggest they'd ever seen. Custer was also told to wait for Brigadier General Alfred Terry and Colonel John Gibson's troops to get there before beginning an attack. Instead, Custer decided to attack his enemies immediately. He was afraid that the Sioux and the Cheyenne would escape if he waited. Custer was forced to retreat his troops to a nearby hill, where they all died facing continual physical attacks. 8. Harrier Jets. If you ask some, the Harrier Jet is one of the best designed fighter aircraft ever to take to the skies. But even those who champion the Harrier will admit that it has many inherent flaws and a long history of crashes, making one wonder if it was worth all it went through to achieve its glory and fame. Developed during the 1960s, the Harrier is perhaps best known for its helicopter-like hovering abilities. It can perform short takeoffs and vertical landings, eliminating its need for long runways and making it an ideal choice for use on an aircraft carrier. Journalist Alex Davies covered the jet's infamy in 2014, shortly after a Harrier crashed into and destroyed 3 homes in California. Not long before that, one of the notorious aircraft crashed into the desert floor south of Phoenix. Thankfully, nobody was injured in any of these accidents. 2 years later, in 2016, a Harrier caught fire as it was escaping, and the pilot narrowly escaped without injuries. It was later determined that the engine had failed for unknown reasons, and that the pilot was lucky to be alive. But not all accidents involving Harriers have had such fortunate outcomes. More than half of the very first versions of the Harrier crashed, yet the aircraft continued to be produced, and new models were developed based on earlier models. And while these newer models proved to be safer than their predecessors, they still have an atrocious safety record. During the Falkland Islands War, the Argentinian military inflicted extensive damage on the British Harrier fleet. In response to a question about why this happened, industrial maintenance expert Christian A. Rodriguez described the Sea Harrier as a cheaply made and designed aircraft based on the Harrier, a ground attack plane. He further explained in his own words, "It can't run, it can't climb, it can't accelerate fast, it can't go far, it can't load much." So the Harrier was a failure in many ways, in its use over both solid ground and water. 7. Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in a mission codenamed Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's plan was to conquer Russia before the harsh and unforgiving winter set in, and he was confident that his forces would achieve a quick victory. 3 million German and Axis troops stormed into the Soviet Union and came face to face with the massive but unprepared Red Army. Not only had Joseph Stalin ignored warnings about the invasion, but his forces were also poorly trained. Over 1,000 Soviet aircraft were shot down on the first day alone. In the coming days, the Nazis took millions of Red Army soldiers as prisoners. Armed SS death squads, known as the Einsatzgruppen, followed behind the army, slaughtering civilians en masse. Despite its many losses, the Red Army fiercely resisted, and their fighting and counterattacks took an immense toll on the Nazis and slowed their advance toward Moscow. Hitler ordered the military to focus on seizing other cities, and it gave the Red Army time to prepare for Moscow's defense. The Germans were eventually ordered to head back toward Moscow and became stuck outside the city during Rasputitsa, a time of the year when unpaved roads become muddy and difficult to travel on. Already in a vulnerable position, the Nazis then encountered the strengthened Red Army. The Soviets defeated the Germans with help from Siberian forces. By then, winter was approaching, and in December 1941, the Red Army launched a counterattack, forcing the Nazis to retreat. Over 1 million German and Axis soldiers died during Operation Barbarossa, which failed in its goal of forcing the Soviet Union into submission. Hitler blamed the winter weather for the failure, but experts say that the Nazis failed to plan for long distances and rough terrain, while underestimating the Red Army's strength. Hitler attempted to take the Soviet Union again the following year, and he once again failed. 6. Teutoburg Forest. In the year 9 AD, the Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions of soldiers into what is now Germany's Teutoburg Forest, where they suffered what some historians consider to be Rome's greatest defeat. In hindsight, the reasons for this devastating blow are painfully obvious. Not only was Varus unfamiliar with the territory, but it also ignored advice from German noblemen who'd forewarned him of a planned uprising by his trusted advisor, Arminius. Arminius had somehow forged a secret alliance of Germanic tribes who until then had historically been enemies with one another. He lied to Varus and said that there was a local rebellion, prompting the general to take a shortcut through Teutoburg Forest, intending to put a stop to the fictional uprising. Varus relied on Arminius to navigate through the woods. At some point, Arminius said that he was going to search for Germanic troops who were willing to support the Roman campaign. But he led his forces in a series of attacks against the Romans. About 15,000 to 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, including Varus, while others were taken for ransom or forced into slavery. Historians blame the defeat on Varus's arrogance and ignorance. They say that he failed to take proper precautions, like sending scouts into the forest ahead of the main force. He also underestimated Arminius' capabilities and ignored the glaringly obvious warning signs that something terrible was about to happen. 5. The Battle of Agincourt. The 100 Years' War was a lengthy conflict between England and France that lasted from 1337 to 1453. The war revolved mainly around disputed claims to the French throne.
One of France's biggest defeats came at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Negotiations with the French kingdom had failed to come to a resolution after several decades of relative peace, and King Henry V of England led 11,000 troops into northern France. They were exhausted and vastly outnumbered by the 20,000 French soldiers they came face to face with at Agincourt. Equipped with longbows, English archers shot arrows at the French forces as they struggled to advance across the battlefield in heavy armor. The French had grossly miscalculated the effectiveness of the English longbows. They tried to charge at the archers, but were met by a line of pointed stakes that had been put down to protect the English soldiers. By then, the French were severely weakened and fighting a losing battle. Henry ordered his men to charge at the enemy with axes and swords, and they easily defeated the French, who suffered 6,000 losses compared to just 400 English casualties. The English had defeated the odds, and their victory at Agincourt was a major stepping stone towards securing Henry V's ascension to the French throne 5 years later. Which country do you think has had a bigger military impact on Europe throughout history, France or England? Share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. 4. F-35 Failure. The F-35 was supposed to become the world's most advanced stealth fighter jet. Designed by Lockheed Martin in partnership with the US government and several allies, including the UK, Italy, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Australia, and Canada, it was meant to replace aging Cold War-era fighter jets. The program's official website describes the F-35 as the world's most survivable and lethal fighter aircraft. It says that the project is responsible for creating tens of thousands or more high-paying jobs around the world. But some things seem better than they actually are, and many will argue that the F-35 is precisely an example of this. Forbes recently reported that the project is essentially a failure. The F-35 was supposed to be lightweight and affordable, but the technology that was added to the design over the years made it increasingly heavy, which proved to be self-defeating. The aircraft was unreliable, high maintenance, and extremely costly, with each jet costing around $100 million. This type of fighter jet is not ideal for everyday use, according to Air Force Chief of Staff General Charles Brown Jr., so the F-35 failed to fulfill the needs of what he describes as low-end operations. Simply put, its designers over-equipped it in an effort to maximize its capabilities, rendering it inappropriate for its intended use. According to recent updates, officials were trying to decide if and how it might be possible to design and build an affordable lightweight fighter jet. Should they repeat the same mistakes that happened with the F-35, it could amount even more time and money spent on repeating history. 3. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Cuban revolutionary and dictator Fidel Castro rose to power in 1959 during the Cold War. Knowing he had an amicable relationship with the communist Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, the US government was eager to help overthrow Castro in any way possible. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, hatched a plot to train 1,000 Cuban exiles for an invasion of the country. The agency believed that Cuban citizens and factions of its military would support the campaign. President John F. Kennedy approved the plan in 1961. The US government tried to keep the mission a secret, but it became a hot topic of conversation among Cuban exiles in Miami. Castro learned of the secret plan with plenty of time to prepare. In April 1961, American-sponsored bombers that were painted to look like Cuban military aircraft missed several targets. Castro's air force was left mostly intact, and the media soon exposed the US government's support for the invasion. JFK cancelled a second airstrike, but green-lighted plans for a Cuban exile force to attack Castro's military. The brigade immediately encountered heavy fire upon landing at the Bay of Pigs. 2 ships were sunk, half of the exiles' air support was shot down, and ground forces were hindered by wet equipment and a lack of ammunition. JFK sent American fighter planes to aid the failing invasion, but they arrived late and were shot down by the Cuban military. Meanwhile, Castro sent over 20,000 troops toward the beach. Over 100 of the exiles were killed, and 1,100 surrendered. The Bay of Pigs invasion backfired miserably and helped to solidify Castro's power. He gained support among Cuban citizens and throughout Latin America by accusing the Americans of being imperialist bullies. The ordeal was also a major selling point in his appeal to the Soviet Union for additional financial aid. Relationships between the US and Cuba remain rocky to this day. President Barack Obama attempted to restore diplomatic ties, but many of these reforms were reversed during the Trump administration. For now, the future of the relationship between the two countries remains uncertain. 2. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. In 1812, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia. By then, he'd assembled the largest army in the history of warfare. Known as the Grande Armée, it numbered as many as 685,000 troops from all over Europe. In June of that year, Napoleon led his forces through Poland and into Russia with the goal of forcing Tsar Alexander to rejoin the continental blockade of the United Kingdom. The continental blockade was a trading embargo that Napoleon had imposed against the British and that Alexander had stopped cooperating with. Much to Napoleon's surprise, the Russians refused to negotiate. Instead, they pulled back and let the intruders take the city of Vilna. Meanwhile, bad weather killed many of Napoleon's troops, while others deserted to search for food and plunder. As the summer dragged on, the Russians continued to retreat, setting fire to buildings, settlements, and crops to prevent them from falling into French hands. The Grande Armée grew increasingly weak as its soldiers suffered from disease and oppressive heat and died in battle. French forces eventually reached Moscow, only to find it burning, with most of its residents gone and little food left behind. By then, winter was approaching. Knowing his soldiers wouldn't survive the harsh cold, Napoleon led his 100,000 surviving soldiers out of the city. Russian forces attacked them on their way out. Meanwhile, winter arrived early and food was scarce. As a result, thousands more men and horses died. Several thousand wounded soldiers were left behind. Russia, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia rejoined the British fight against the French, and in early 1814, Paris was captured. Napoleon attempted to regain power, but unfortunately for him, his glory days were over. 1. The Battle of Kuranes. We all know that drinking too much alcohol can lead to poor decisions. The Austrian army learned this lesson the hard way in 1788 by making drunken mistakes that proved fatal at the Battle of Kuranes. The skirmish happened during the Austro-Turkish War, also known as the Habsburg-Ottoman War, which pitted the Austrians and the Ottoman Empire against each other. The two sides were battling for control of the Danube River in what is now Romania. One night, a group of Austrian cavalrymen, or hussars, went out scouting for Ottoman soldiers. They came across a group of Romani travelers, commonly called gypsies, who offered to sell them some schnapps. The troops eagerly indulged. A short while later, some Austrian infantrymen saw that there was a party going on and demanded some alcohol. The cavalrymen who arrived there before them refused to share, and the disagreement erupted into gunfire. As the two groups shot at each other despite being from the same army, someone yelled, "Turks! Turks!" The hussars fled back toward their camp. An officer heard them coming and, assuming they were Ottoman soldiers, ordered his troops to attack them. Unable to see the approaching group under the cover of night, they complied. Over 1,000 Austrians died at the hands of their own army during the confused skirmish. The chaos worked to the advantage of the Ottomans, who easily took Karansebs when they arrived 2 days later. Thanks for watching. What do you think was the biggest military blunder of all time? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos like these. See you next time. Bye.